Hello, everyone. Welcome to Risk Awareness Week 2022 and this workshop on the Metalog distributions, the future of risk management quantification. This is Tom Keelin coming to you from Chiloquin, Oregon. As you can see, many thoughtful people are saying very interesting things about the Metalogs. We will explore in this workshop why, from a very practical and down-to-earth perspective. We're calling this the future of risk management quantification, but actually it's also the present. Everything that I'll be talking about is available and can be done practically and added to your box of risk management tools today if you choose to do so. The agenda that we're following is shown here. I'm going to spend just a very brief 10 minutes or so giving an introduction as to why Metalog distributions are appropriate and may be valuable for risk management. We'll spend roughly 35 minutes on practical uses. How can you represent empirical data, simulated data, expert elicited data, and so forth. And then we'll spend the last 15 minutes or so working through how you can use Metalog distributions actually in your modeling environment. These times are all approximate, but they'll give you a sense of how we're proceeding. So let's begin. If there's one key message from this talk, it is that Metalog distributions are likely your best starting point for fitting continuous distributions to data. What kind of data? Well, it can be expert elicited data, as you see on the left. If you elicit 10, 50, 90 quantiles, the Metalog distribution will go through those data points exactly. You can also do this with 4 or 5 or more data points in which the Metalog would go through those points exactly, or approximately if you prefer. Simulated data is another source of data from your computer models. If you wish to display that simulated data as a continuous distribution, Metalog distributions are likely your best choice for doing that, and it's very simple, very fast, and closed form. And then on the right, it's empirical data. As risk managers, there's a huge amount of empirical data available to which you would typically want to fit a continuous probability distribution and then use that distribution in subsequent analysis. Metalogs are an excellent choice for doing that, and let me explain why. The reason to opt for Metalog distributions instead of classical distributions like the normal or the log normal and so forth, the Metalogs have a whole series of advantages, and the key ones are listed here. Perhaps most important, the Metalogs have virtually unlimited shape flexibility. That is, they can shape themselves better to the shape of your data than other distributions. And like a Taylor series, they can have any number of terms. The second is that Metalog distributions are easily parameterized. They're parameterized, in fact, by data, not by parameters like mean and variance and skewness and so forth. They're actually parameterized by data, and it's a simple least squares fit. Third, you have a choice of boundedness. If you want your distribution to be unbounded or have a lower bound, that is semi-bounded, or an upper bound, or bounded on both ends, that's easy to do with Metalogs. Fourth reason is the equations are simple and closed form. There are no complicated statistical functions in the Metalog world. And 5, the Metalogs are easy to simulate because they have a closed form quantile function, that is f to the -1. So let me briefly show what I mean by this Taylor series. The conclusion here, though, is that virtually unlimited, the Metalogs have virtually unlimited applicability, not just in risk management, but in any field of human endeavor that uses data. Now, without going, I know there's no point in going through this equation in detail. That's explained in other places. But the point I wish to make here is that the Metalog equation, which you see at the top of this slide, is like a Taylor series. You can use just the first 2 terms of the Metalog, in which case it's a logistic probability distribution exactly, but you can use 3 terms or 4 terms. You can expand any number of terms to any number of terms you want, and each additional term adds shape flexibility for a tighter fit to your data. Now, that's a good thing and a bad thing in that you don't want to overfit your data. You don't want to fit it too tightly because you'll be fitting the noise rather than signal, but you don't want to underfit it either. And we will talk about how to create a good fit to your data with Metalogs. But basically, the single Metalog equation I've just shown there is an alternative to using classical distributions. As you can see on the left, Wikipedia lists about 115 named classical distributions. Many of these names you're familiar with. On the right, there are about 60 new distributions in the Metalog family, that is unbounded, semi-bounded, high, semi-bounded, low, bounded distributions. There are about 15 practical ones of each, that is you can go up to like 15 terms in each of them. And a key message to understand here is that you don't. Once you start moving into the Metalog world, you won't need the classical distributions any longer, except possibly for a few very special purposes. But typically, you won't need them because any of these classical distributions can be represented by the single Metalog equation. And furthermore, the Metalog can represent all kinds of distributions in between all the classical distributions and all the combinations of those because of its shape flexibility. Let me illustrate how a Metalog distribution can substitute, for example, for a normal distribution. Here I'm showing 105 points that were taken off the CDF of a standard normal distribution. If you use those points to parameterize a Metalog distribution using ordinary least squares, and you use just a two-term Metalog, you'll see that you get sort of an approximate fit, but that it's not that great. But if you go to a four-term Metalog parameterized with these points, all of a sudden it's very close to the standard normal, 6, 8, 10. By the time I get to 10 terms, you can't see the difference. What about in terms of the density function? Well, the two-term Metalog looks like that. 4, 6, 8, 10. Again, by the time you get to 10 terms, you can't see the difference between the standard normal distribution and the Metalog that approximates it. The same is true for virtually all the other classical distributions that I showed on the previous slide. And that's because there's a theorem. The theorem is that any probability distribution with a continuous quantile function can be approximated arbitrarily closely by a Metalog. That's any probability distribution. The proof of that is that basically any continuous function can be approximated arbitrarily closely by a polynomial. And as I showed you a few slides ago, the Metalog distribution contains a polynomial. So this theorem is true simply as an application of the Weierstrass approximation theorem. There's some observations that follow from this. First is that a single set of Metalog equations can represent any distribution. So there's some potentially obsolete questions. What probability distribution is best for this application to fit to your data? You don't have to ask that anymore because just use a Metalog and you have a good fit. How do we fit our distribution to data? Most distributions are complicated. They require nonlinear optimization of some sort in order to come up with the best fit to data. With Metalogs, it's very easy. It's just ordinary least squares, so the fit is easy. There are some practical limitations, which I'll mention here. Distributions with extreme spikes or discontinuity or extremely fat tails. And so there are practical limitations and considerations that I'll just briefly mention here. One limitation is feasibility. Take a look here at, for example, suppose you did this expert assessment and the red points there represent the expert assessment over whatever variable is of interest. But those are the points you've assessed from an expert. And then if you fit those points with a four-term Metalog, you see you've got a curve that does quite a good job approximating those points. In fact, it's the best least squares to those points within the Metalog family. You can see the PDF on the left. But what if you use too many terms for this? What if you use 6 terms? Well, the good news about using 6 terms in the Metalog equation and fitting that to the data is you'd get a curve that runs exactly through all 6 of those points. The bad news is the curve you end up with is not actually a probability distribution. We call this infeasible. The PDF goes negative, which is not legal in the probability world. So you wouldn't want to use 6 terms for this situation. You'd want to only use 4. Infeasibility is one issue, but another set of considerations, as I mentioned, is overfitting and underfitting. And here you see a data set represented by the red dots here. It's 1,000 data out of an actual bidding decision simulation. It's a simulation of the portfolio value of 259 assets. And as you can see at the top there, if you fit that with a two-term Metalog, you get okay fit, but probably it's underfit because you can see that the red dots in the blue curve are not exactly aligned. A 5-term Metalog, however, does an extremely good job, and you can see the associated PDF on the right. If you were to use a 16-term Metalog and fit it to this data, you see some wavy, in fact, you see 3 modes there. Well, for this particular data set, there's no reason that it should have 3 modes. And what you're actually seeing there is we've used too many terms, and we've overfit the Metalog to the data, and what the curve on the right is showing, the PDF, is basically we're fitting both the noise as well as the signal. Whereas in the 5-term Metalog, we're pretty much fitting the signal. That is the true reasonable distribution of this simulated data. So more information is freely available here. We have not in this video covered the derivation, for example, of the Metalog equations or any intuitive justification for that. If you wish to hear that, there's an 18-minute video called Overview of the Metalogs, and you can click here to get, it's on the Metalogs YouTube channel. So take a look at there, as well as there are lots of other Metalog videos there explaining various aspects of the Metalog system. There's also a Wikipedia article. You can click on this link to go directly there if you would prefer to read about it rather than watch a video. There's the Metalog website, which has links to all of the relevant information about Metalogs that we're currently aware of, and that includes a link to the original journal article published in the Journal of Decision Analysis. Now, we're going to move on very shortly to practical demonstrations. We're going to do these practical demonstrations in Excel using what you see on the left there is the Excel workbooks of the first list of software resources. But this is just one of many software resources that are available to you, and you should certainly feel free to use Metalogs within whatever software system of your choosing you would like to use. The ones we know of that contain good Metalog implementations are listed on the left. The Frontline Systems, Analytic Solver, which is an Excel add-in, and they also have much more powerful software that makes full use of the Metalogs. Lumina Decision Systems Analytica is excellent for modeling with Metalogs. There's a Bayes Fusion's Genie. There are R and Python implementations of the Metalog. Also the SIPMath modeler tools and ChanceCalc from probabilitymanagement.org. And then finally, SmartOrg has a Portfolio Navigator that's a good implementation of Metalogs. We try to keep the website relatively updated, so if we become aware of new software implementations, we will post them here on the website. For these videos, we're going to be using some Metalog workbooks that are explained in detail on the YouTube channel, and you can click here to go to that YouTube channel. What we're going to be doing is we're going to take a knowledge of, well, we're not going to explain in detail how the workbooks work. We're just going to show the practical application of those workbooks in terms of fitting them to data and using them with data. If you do want more detail or background about how the workbooks actually work and what are all the controls and how are the calculations actually made, feel free to go to the YouTube channel and check this out. So at this point, we're going to go to the next step. We're going to begin practical uses, and we will be looking first at representing empirical data and representing simulated data using Metalog distributions. We'll begin here with a simple example of representing empirical data, and then immediately follow that with exploration of multiple data sets in an Excel workbook that you can download and use yourself as part of this learning process. So every data set has its story, and the purpose of the Metalog distributions is really to tell whatever story it is that is appropriate for your data set and represent that data as a continuous probability distribution. Here we have a particular data set, which I gathered some years ago, and the data set is the weight of steelhead trout caught and released on the Babine River in British Columbia in the years 2010 through 2014. That's a 5-year period. We have 3,474 data in this data set. And as you can see, the data set shown in the CDF on the left, all the data points are the gray and yellow. The green curve is the log normal distribution fit to that data, and the blue curve is a Metalog distribution fit to that data. Well, let's explore a little bit about that. But before we do, I'd like to say something about the life cycle of steelhead trout. Unlike salmon, they can spawn many times. They're born in the river, they go to the ocean. After a few years, they come back and spawn. They're called one salt fish at that point. They go back to the ocean. Those that survive come back some years later. They're two salt fish at that point, and they've gotten heavier and bigger in ocean-rich feeding grounds. A few very large steelhead could be 3 or 4 salt steelhead. This one that you see pictured at the below here weighs about 20 pounds. That's probably a 3 or 4 salt steelhead there. If you asked fish biologists certain research questions like, well, how much, what's the weight of these fish, the 1 salt versus 2 salt fish? How much do they increase in weight by the time they get to be 2 salt fish? Fish biologists would have little answer to that question because the fish all look the same when they're in the river, and they're both 1 salt fish and 2 salt fish in the river at the same time. What's the relative population? How many 1 salt fish versus 2 salt fish are in the river? There's really no good answer to that, but we can begin to see an answer when we do the analysis. Here's the histogram of all those 3,474 data points, and here's the best fit with the log normal distribution. Looks pretty much like you'd expect with the log normal distribution. Now let's fit that with a Metalog. Well, with the 2-term Metalog, it looks a lot like a log normal distribution, not surprisingly. What about 4 terms, 6, 8, 10? When you get to 10 terms, suddenly one sees that there's a bimodal shape in the data that the Metalog distribution is actually capturing here. And very possibly that could be the explanation for 1 salt versus 2 salt fish. That is how much weight they gain, maybe about 5 pounds from 5 to 10. Also the relative population sizes in the river. There would have to be lots of other study that would go on to determine for sure that this is 1 salt versus 2 salt fish, but the Metalog distribution gives one an inclination or gives one an explanation that possibly could be or can or could be subject to further study. So let's talk about how we actually do that fitting. I'm going to go to a workbook now that is, you can download this from metalogdistributions.com, demos.html, and just go to the empirical and simulation data. And when you're there, you might as well download the other workbooks there as well. You'll open an spreadsheet that looks like this. Let's go to that spreadsheet now. Here it is. All right. Now, what do we have here? Well, in this spreadsheet, I've got 10 illustrative data sets, and these are down here starting in row 49. And for each data set, I've got the number of data. These are all equally likely data, and this is the equally likely data multi-data set Excel workbook that you can download from the website. But this one is populated specifically for data to illustrate how we use the Metalogs for this Risk Awareness Week workshop. So the first data set is from the field of probability. The short name is normal samples. What it is, it's just 100 samples from a standard normal distribution. We're going to fit a Metalog to that just to get warmed up and to make it easy. I'm going to talk a little bit further about the decision analysis bidding simulation that I showed you as part of the introduction. How did we fit that? What about the steelhead example that I just showed? How did we fit that? I've got several other examples here. I've got one from hydrology, one for returns on investing in gold, insurance claims, which can be quite relevant, obviously, in risk management. And let's go through and talk about some of the problems and opportunities and how easy or difficult it is to fit a Metalog here. The data set in use is specified right here. So right here, the data set, the data that you're seeing is this 100 samples from the normal distribution. If I can click this, when I click this, it'll go to another data set. But let's just use the normal now. I've got a 5-term Metalog here, which is a pretty good approximation of that data, as you can see. It looks a lot like a normal distribution, which of course it should. If I used fewer terms, let's go for 4, 3, 2 terms. Well, it's not as good a fit to the data, and it's not quite the normal shape, so that's not surprising. But by the time you get to 5 terms, you've got something that's a very good fit to the data. And then if you went up to, let's say 12 terms, well, you've got something that's even a better fit to the data, yeah, but you're amplifying, as I say, the noise rather than the signal. You're just, you're over amplifying the variability associated with random sampling. So in this particular case, probably what I would use is a 5-term Metalog to represent that data. So let's go to a second data set. Let's go to the bidding decision simulation. And this was 259 financial assets. There were important decisions associated with these. And we needed a probability distribution to represent the data. There's 1,000 data in this data set, as you can see here. I'm using an unbounded Metalog, which is the one that's what that U means here to represent this data. And as you can see, the values go from about 20 to 60. The 5-term Metalog, that's usually a good place to start, by the way, depending on your data set. You can always ramp up from there. The Metalog panel on the right here shows what is this curve going to look like if you fit more and more terms up to 16-term Metalog? What does it look like if you fit fewer? But in this case, there's no reason not to simply use the 5-term Metalog. It's quite a good fit. And as I showed before, if you were to use 2 terms, well, that's not nearly as good a fit. And if you use 16 terms, then that's a blow up of this n equals 16 one. You get sort of a waviness that's blowing up the noise too much, and so that's probably overfitting. We'll go back to 5 terms here. All right, what about the third data set? Well, this is one. This is the one that I talked about in the example just a few minutes ago. If you fit that with a 5-term Metalog, what you see is you're getting a unimodal fit. And that could be fine. And depending on the data set and the story behind that data set, a unimodal fit might be fine. There's a 4-term Metalog fit. It's extremely good fit to the data. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't tell the story of the 1 salt versus the 2 salt fish. And if we look over here at the Metalog panel, we see everything in the range of, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 terms. All of those are showing a very stable bimodal shape when you fit that to a Metalog. So let's just go to the 10-term Metalog. Now, in this case, we have the contextual information about 1 salt and 2 salt fish. So one would think that 10 terms is probably a better fit to this data set than would be using the 5 terms, because the 5 terms obscures the natural bimodality of the data. Now, another thing one can do is use various goodness of fit criteria, such as AIC or BIC, that have been developed in statistics for determining which of a whole set of probability distributions are the best fit to a set of data, given that you'd like to not overfit and not underfit. Well, in this case, it turns out if you use those statistical criteria, which you can actually, and you can actually do those calculations if you want in Frontline Systems Analytics Solver, which is an Excel add-in. But if you use those statistical criteria, you will find that the 10-term Metalog, the 10-term semi-bounded Metalog, I've got a lower bound of 0 in here, is actually the best fit, even penalizing for, there's a penalty in there for having more terms than one needs. it's actually the best, the 10 term is actually the best fit according to these statistical criteria. I would furthermore just offer a quick observation here. Here, what I've specified down here is that 0 is the lower bound for this data set. If I change that to, let's say, 3, and I say no steelhead all steelhead are greater than 3 pounds, well, there's some 3 pound steelhead in this data set, so that becomes illegal. The lower bound has to be lower than all the samples. But if I said 2, for example, then all of a sudden I've got a distribution that has a lower bound of 2. And if I were to make the assertion that all steelhead were bigger than 2 pounds, then I might want to fit it with a curve that had a lower bound of 2. But in this case, I think 0 is quite reasonable, so we'll leave it at that. Let's look at a third data set, or another data set here. This one is a measurement of 95 years of gauge height on the Williamson River, and you can't quite see that river, but it's right behind me in this in the picture, which is the background screen. In my photo here, and there's a river back there, and there's 95 years of gauge height, maximum gauge height for that river. This is fit, if you fit it with a 10-term Metalog, you see this very interesting shape here, but you could also fit it with a 4-term Metalog or a 5-term Metalog, and you end up with quite a reasonable fit to the data. You could pick any of those. It really depends on it could depend on statistical criteria like AIC and BIC if you wanted to use those, or if you have a contextual explanation. In this particular case, I presented this chart one time to a group of people that included someone who was an expert in stream flows and river stream beds, and a hydrologist, and he said, "Oh my goodness," he says, "I think that curve is probably telling us something about the shape of the river bottom." And I queried that, and he provided an explanation, which it's just a hypothesis, but he said, it could be that the river has a relatively flat bottom, so it's hard to, as you get more and more rain, it doesn't fill up very far in terms of gauge height. But once you get to a particular point, it spreads out wider, and then it's hard to get it to go up above more than a particular height, like 5 feet. And then there are a few extreme examples where it goes up about 10 or 15. Well, there's a contextual explanation that you might want to explore further for such a data set. Given his explanation, in various presentations, I've tended to use 10 terms, but you could use fewer if you had no reason to believe that this extra number of terms were appropriate. Let's go down now to data set number 5. This is a data set that is the financial returns on gold. In fact, these are the quarterly returns on gold if you invested in the gold at the beginning of each quarter and cashed out at the end of each quarter, from March 31st, 1998 to December 30th, 2019, you'd have this data set here that consists of roughly 87 points. As you can see, for 10 terms, the Metalog for that is not feasible, which is what it means if there's a blank in this. In fact, it says in the message it's not feasible for this N. But what if you went to a 4-term Metalog or a 5-term Metalog, often a good place to start? You'd end up with what looks like a pretty good fit with a unimodal distribution if you go to, but interesting, and so you could use that for your application, whatever analysis you're doing. But in this case, if you go to 6 or 7 or 8, all these are bimodal distributions, okay? And the person that gave me this data set was actually a financial analyst who puts out reports that are used by a very large financial institution for advising their clients. And when he first saw this result, he thought, well, wait a minute, there's no reason for returns on gold, quarterly returns on gold, to be bimodal. And then he said, gee, maybe there is. I'm going to have to go look at those dates where, basically what this bimodal shape is saying is that you're more likely to have returns below 0 or above 0 rather than right at zero, or that is, no change in the price. And he said, I think it may be true that central banks that really influence heavily the price of gold all move in a herd behavior, in which case, if they all move together in a given quarter, then the price moves down. If they all move together in the other direction, if they end up buying, even in a given quarter, the price goes up. And he went off in order to try to explore that further. If that were important, then clearly, that could make a difference in the design of financial derivatives and investment decisions that people actually make. Let's go to one more data set here, and this is a risk management data set that was submitted by Alex, who has organized this risk awareness 2022 conference. Alex has access to insurance data. This is an actual insurance claims data set where it's personal employee insurance claims, and it includes disability, death, etc., across the dates. And these are actual claims submitted by actual people from the 1st of January 2018 through the 11th of November, or through the 21st of November 2021. Now, if you look at this data set, and I forgot to switch to it. Here's the data set number 6. What you see is of some interest. There's some vertical spikes. There's some vertical segments on the CDF in this data set, and that makes it. And furthermore, the data set is extremely skewed. If you look at the data, the highest claim was for $643,000. And if you go down to the bottom here, the lowest claim was for $1,000. And by and away, the largest segment of claims, there are just very few of these very large claims. So the data set is heavily skewed. And you'll also see that there are a lot of claims like right on $100,000. What could that be? Well, that's probably true. That's probably the case because there are sublimits in the insurance policy. Certain kinds of sub-limits might have $100,000 maximum or $1,000 maximum and so forth. And that's probably what these vertical spikes are. The question is, how would you fit that to data? Well, you can see here that all the Metalogs 4 and above are not feasible for this data set. But you can also see that Metalogs 2 and 3, so let's take a 3-term Metalog here. Well, that's feasible, but it's so skewed that it's hard to actually view it and see what's going on. Now, there are a couple of ways you could deal with that. One is, and I'm not going to do it now for lack of time, but one is you could adjust the scale of this graph, and instead of having it go from 0 to $7 million, you could have it go from 0 to $100,000, and then you would see. Well, actually, I'll just do it for this one. Then you would see that, let's go with 100,000 as the maximum scale on the axis. Okay, then you see, so you do have a nice smooth Metalog distribution that pretty reasonably fits the data apparently, but you're also not capturing all the points because the points go up to $600,000. So I'm going to reset that for the moment and say, in this particular case, if you're going to fit a Metalog to it, it might be better to fit a Metalog, for example, to the log of this data, so it's so extremely skewed. So what I've got in data set 7 is the log of the insurance claims. That's just the log of the values that are in data set 6. And so let's fit to that as data set 7. And now you can see, all of a sudden the 3-term Metalog looks like a pretty good fit. Now, if you, and the question is that a sufficiently good fit? For these purposes, Alex had said to me that, what I really need is a curve that reasonably goes through the data, because what we're looking at is broad pricing decisions for these kinds of insurance policies, and this kind of a Metalog is perfect for that application, and I'd like to use it for that. However, in another situation, you might find that you need to represent those insurance policy, what could be sublimits, those vertical segments in the CDF. You might need to represent those with a high degree of accuracy. And if you did, a Metalog distribution probably would not be appropriate for that. What you'd need to do is do a probability tree representation where you could put discrete probabilities and discrete values on these segments. So that completes my illustration here of hands-on Metalogs fitting to empirical and simulated data. And now what we're going to do is turn to some representing expert elicited data. Because of their shape flexibility and ease of fitting to data, Metalogs can be ideal for representing expert opinion. Let's take a look at some practical examples. For this demonstration, I'm going to use the data set called expert elicited data that if you haven't downloaded it already, you may wish to do so now. There's another related link in your downloads to the SPT Metalogs, and those are Metalogs that are parameterized by only 3 data points, such as 10, 50, 90. If you decide after watching this that you want to use exclusively Metalogs that are parameterized by 3 points, then you may wish to click this link and download the associated file and watch the YouTube video describing it. But for now, let's go to the expert elicited data file and see how it works. So here you have the worksheet. Any cells in this worksheet that are light yellow are cells that you are invited to change and play around with. Any cells that are green are calculations that you wouldn't want to change, and cells that are light blue, such as this one, are optional inputs for you. So suppose instead of calling this variable 1, we want to call this market size. There you go. Need to fix it, market size. And now that name appears on the graphics here. And let's suppose in terms of market size, we have assessments of, let's say, a 10% chance of selling less than 25 million widgets, a 50-50 chance of selling less than 40 million, and a 90% chance of selling less than 60 million widgets. Well, that's sufficient detail for a 3-term Metalog to go right through, exactly through all those points. Now let's suppose the expert wants to add a couple of other points, like a 1 in 100 chance of selling less than 10 million, and also a 99% chance of selling less than 90 million. So if I input those points, what we see is the 3-term Metalog still does a very good job of representing those points. However, you can also see that it doesn't go through each of those 5 points exactly. There's some, it basically is the best approximate fit it can do to 5 points with 3 terms. Now, if you went over here and changed this to 4 terms, you'd get a tighter fit. And if you changed it to 5 terms, then the 5-term Metalog will go through each of those 5 data points exactly. So now, note for the moment that this is a market size assessment, but the Metalog distribution that you see there has a tail that goes below 0, which wouldn't make any sense because the market size can't be less than 0. So what you would do in that case is simply go to your boundedness and choose a semi-bounded Metalog on the lower end. You could put in a lower bound of 0. If you want to put in a lower bound of 5, you could do that as well and still get an associated distribution. But for now, let's go back to 0. And so now we have a more authentic representation of a market size distribution. Let's go back to the 3-point version for a moment so I can show you a few other features of this. 3 points, you cannot use 5 terms, but you could use 3 terms that will go through all 3 points exactly. There you have it. Now, experts can give you all kinds of data, some of which may not be consistent and may be quite odd or off. So for example, suppose the expert in a later assessment might have said, well, the median is 50 rather than 40. Well, that new data point is inconsistent. But note what happens. The Metalog simply adjusts itself to go as closely as it can in a least squares sense through all of the data points. So you still have quite a reasonable distribution. The another feature of this that you may want to take a look at is the boundedness alternative. So, for example, suppose this isn't market size, but suppose this is an assessment of market share. Well, in that case, the lower bound of 0 is fine, but you don't want a distribution that goes above 100 because you can't have more than 100% market share. So in that case, you would like to have a distribution that's bounded on both ends, and you choose the bounded alternative here. And as you see now, you have a distribution that is bounded below by 0 and above by 100. And of course, if you wanted to change these bounds, you could. If you wanted to say that the upper bound was 90, then of course you could change it to that. But realistically, for market share, the lower bound would be more like 100. So that's the quick demo of expert assessment. And let's continue on to the next step, which I will bring us to by going to the combining the expert opinion version of this talk. So let's talk about how one can combine expert opinion. It's extremely easy to do with Metalogs. There are basically two different ways of combining expert opinion that appear in the literature and that are in common use in practice. One is on the left called linear opinion pooling, and basically it says that if you're taking a weighted average of experts' views, what you would do is you would take a weighted average of the density function for each expert in order to get the consensus distribution. And in this particular case, where there are 17 experts, that results in the orange curve that you can see as the probability density curve. On the right is another way of combining expert assessments, and that is to say that the combined view at each probability is the average of the expert's quantiles. So, for example, the expert combined median is the weighted average of the expert medians. The expert combined 90% quantile is the weighted average of the expert's 90% quantiles. That method of combining expert opinion is called Vincentization. And it's used less commonly, perhaps, than linear opinion pooling. However, there is a recent management science article indicated here at the bottom, where the overall conclusion is that averaging quantiles for a given probability is as good or better than averaging probabilities as a method for aggregating probability forecasts. This is quite a well-researched paper, and it gives considerable life and a rationale for using the method on the right. It turns out if you use the method on the right, it's very, very simple using Metalog distributions. And in fact, if your principle is that you're going to, for each level of probability, you're going to take a weighted average of expert quantiles, then you have the wonderful property that the weighted average Metalog distribution is a Metalog distribution exactly, parameterized by these by the weighted averages here, and that principle is very closely approximated for, and that's principle is fully accurate for the unbounded Metalog and very closely associated, very closely approximated for the semi-bounded and bounded Metalogs, and basically closely enough that that it's just fine for almost any reasonable use in practice. So let's take a look now at how that would actually work in this case. And in this case, I'm going to use the combining expert opinion file from your downloads. Let's go ahead and go there now. Here we are. So what you see when you open up this page here is you see 10, 50, 90 quantiles for expert 1, and let's say those are 15 million, well, let's say it's a market share again. Let's say 15%, 25%, and 40% for 10, 50, 90. Expert 2 is quite more, is much more optimistic concerning a higher market share. His or hers is 35, 55, and 70 associated with those probabilities. And so expert 2 is the orange curve here. Expert 1 is the blue curve. And using the Vincentization or the combining quantiles method, it's really very simple. If you wanted to put a 50-50 weighting on expert 1 opinion and expert 2's opinion, what you do, as you can see from this equation here, is just average the 10% quantile to get the combined opinion, average the 50% quantile, average the medians to get the combined, and average the 90. And in that case, what you have is this combined opinion curve here, the green curve. Well, what if you what if expert 2 changed his opinion and said, okay, well, it's 50 instead of 60 for a median? Well, then that would just change the shape of the curve, and of course the consensus would adjust. Let's go back to 55. And now suppose you said, well, what if we believe we should put a 75% weight on expert 1 and a 50% a 25% weight on expert 2? Well, then obviously the combined opinion would move closer to expert 1. Suppose we wanted to put only a 10% weight on expert 1, then the combined opinion moves very close to expert 2's assessment. So how does this spreadsheet work? Well, it's just so simple. All we're doing is we're taking these inputs for expert 1, and we've got the expert assessment worksheet here where we've just put these inputs for expert 1. We just connected them using a formula to the overall worksheet, and we did the same thing for expert 2. And then when we got to the combined opinion, which we combined on this worksheet, we just plugged that in to a third virtually identical worksheet where we are parameterizing the combined opinion by the weighted average of the expert opinions. So that concludes this simple demonstration. Obviously, one could expand this. You could put in multiple columns here, and you could put in more worksheets, and you could expand this to any number of experts you wanted, and you have a nice, simple, highly practical way of combining expert opinion. Okay, so let's take a look now at the next key topic here, which is Bayesian updating with new data. This is, and the primary question, of course, is, suppose you've used multiple expert opinions and you've combined them into an investment decision analysis, and then you've got some prior data, let's say on the effectiveness of a new drug, it could be. And you've got prior data, and it's required investment to get some new data. But once you get the new data, you'd like to combine it with the prior data and update your distribution over, whatever might be the variable of interest. Maybe it's cholesterol levels or something like that. And what's your probability distribution? What's your ultimate probability distribution over the cholesterol level measured in the next patient, for example? Well, let's take a look at how you can do this with Metalogs. With Metalogs, it is an amazingly simple process and much simpler than is Bayesian updating with any other probability distributions that are in common use. As an example, I'll use here Montana fly fisherman who, for the first time, goes to the Williamson River in Oregon. These are different ecosystems. He's only had Montana data. He's experienced. He plans to try the Williamson River. But what he doesn't know is that the Williamson River trout are typically much larger than those on the famous Montana rivers, as shown in these pictures. And what he would like to know is how should he update his prior probability distribution over the size of his next trout on the Williamson based on the size of each trout he catches on the Williamson. And he's got a prior probability distribution, of course, based on his Montana data. Maybe he's kept a journal, maybe he has hundreds of fish in that journal. And initially, he might go to the Williamson expecting the fish to be a similar size. And the only way he learns that the Williamson fish are typically bigger is by catching a number of them and then updating his probability distribution over the size of the next fish he'll catch. So basically, what actually happens here is his prior distribution here might very well be the thing that comes out of his Montana journal, where the 10, 50, 90 on inches length of the next fish are 10, 13, and 18, something like that. In fact, the source distribution, the fish he'll catch in the Williamson, are on the average larger. I mean, some of the William fish are smaller than some of the Montana fish, of course, but but most of them on average are going to be larger. And so how would he update his prior distribution after he catches his first fish? That's what's on here. Well, he caught one new fish. Well, that fish is 15 inches. Well, it's a little bigger than what you'd expect, but so what? It doesn't move your posterior distribution after combining the new data with the prior data. It doesn't move it very much. After two fish, it turns out he caught a larger one, like 15 inches, and a smaller one like 10 inches. His distribution didn't move much. But if fish 3 through 6 were 24, 18, 18, and 17, all of a sudden that's significant new information that begins to move his posterior distribution, combining the prior and new data, toward the source distribution of the Williamson. And after catching 100 fish, he will have so much data in line with the Williamson data that his posterior distribution pretty much lines up with the Williamson River distribution. So how does one do that updating in practice? There's MCMC. There are lots of complicated ways out there in the literature for doing Bayesian updating of the parameters of distributions. It turns out that because of the simple linear combination form of the Metalog distribution, that is, those A coefficients, the Metalog distribution is linear in its A coefficients. Metalog Bayesian updating can be extremely, extremely simple. It can be as simple as combining prior data with new data and weighting those two data sets appropriately, and then a least squares fitting of a Metalog to the combined data. Incredibly simple compared to most other Bayesian updating systems. And how is that done? There's not the time to explain it or go through a demonstration spreadsheet here, but we do have a paper that's published in preprint, and there's a full explanation of the method in the OSF preprints online. And to access that, you can simply click this link right here, or simply look it up. So now I'd like to turn to our last section, which is how to use Metalog distributions in your modeling environment. In this final section of our workshop about using Metalog distributions in your models, we're going to discuss three topics: bringing Metalogs into your modeling environment, simulating with Metalogs, and retrieving the Metalog equations. So let's take a look. But before jumping into it, I would like to say that this particular part of the workshop is about using the demonstration workbooks that we've been using throughout this workshop. There are other excellent software resources out there, all listed on the Metalog Distributions website. If you prefer to, and all of them have excellent modeling capabilities. So you may just wish to skip this section and move into R, Python, SIPMAP modeler tools, the Frontline Systems Analytics Solver, or Lumina, or whatever is the software environment you're using for modeling. It'll have its own specific commands and ways of doing things. Here, I'm simply going to show you how to do that kind of modeling in these in the workbooks that you have already downloaded, these two. But then we're also going to use the third workbook called the Equation Maker, and if you haven't downloaded that yet, you may wish to do so now. So let's move ahead, and first we will address the moving of the workbooks and copying these sheets and doing multiple copies, etc., as needed. So, for example, this is the expert assessment workbook as you opened it early on, and this is for expert 1. But what if you wanted a similar sheet to model, let's say, expert 3 or some other expert? Well, the way to do that, the feature of all of these workbooks that look like this is that they are self-contained. there are no macros, there are no named ranges. So as a result of that, you can copy and move them into, either make copies in the same workbook or move them into another workbook without harming either workbook, and you'll end up with a self-contained sheet. So let's just do that. For expert 1 here, suppose we want to have another sheet to model, say, another expert, maybe expert 3. So we go to the tab and then right-click on the tab down at the bottom, click Move or Copy, and let's say we want to create a copy, and we want to do it within the same workbook. So now Excel is working away, and you can see it's created. Here's my expert 1, and then here's a copy of that worksheet. If I want to now, I can rename that as expert 3. And there we go. Now my expert 3 sheet is completely independent from my expert 1 sheet. There's expert 3. Suppose expert 1 has a different opinion. His median is 45 instead of 40, and his 90 percentile is 65 instead of 60. Well, then that's expert 3's distribution, but expert 1's distribution is entirely independent and remains unchanged. Now, suppose we say, well, okay, now that I've encoded expert 3, I would like to move that expert 3 worksheet into the other workbook where we were combining multiple expert opinions. So to do that, now I do have that other workbook open, the combining expert opinions workbook, and it's important that the workbook you're moving into be open as well as the workbook you're moving from. So in this case, I'd right-click on expert 3, go up to Move or Copy. I want to move that worksheet. And in this case, I want to move it to a different workbook. So I want to go to the Combining Expert Opinions workbook. And let's say I want to move it to the end and I want to create a copy. So there we go. And at this point, it'll move a copy of this expert 3 sheet into this workbook. And it turns out there was already an expert 3 in here. So we could make this one, for example, say, we could rename that as expert 4. But the point is that you can have any number of these worksheets in your workbooks. They all operate independently. And so you can change expert 1, 2, 3, and then you could actually come back here and expand this table here to include, let's say we insert some columns, and you could expand that table to include expert 3 and 4 and even 5 if you wanted, and just work it all the way through, build up your modeling environment to be combining more than 2 expert opinions, maybe 3, 4, or 5. So that's a quick way to move these Metalog workbook sheets around into different workbooks. And now let's move to the second topic, which is how to simulate in this particular workbook environment. So let's go back to the expert elicited data workbook. We'll go back to expert 1, and suppose we want to do a simulation of a number of samples of expert opinion from the large graphs that are shown here. Well, in order to after we've got the distribution the way we want it, maybe this is a 55 instead of a 60 or some such thing as that, and we say, okay, that's the expert distribution we want to do a simulation of. Well, on all of these workbooks, what you'll find is there is a simulate, a little simulate section, okay? And what that simulate section does is that for every value of y, it could be a random number, and in fact, in this case, I've got a rand command that gives me a random number. I want to simulate from this curve and get a corresponding value of x. So if my sample was 0.6, I'd want to come over here. My random number was 0.6, I'd want to come over here and then move down and pick off, it looks like 40, or 42 or some such thing as that. So we want to do that simulation. How do we do it? Well, I've just added a little bit of text here. I'm going to create a simulation example where I'm going to simulate for 10 different random numbers here. I'm going to simulate and get 10 different values for x according to this particular Metalog equation. The way I would do that is to, first of all, add the random numbers into all these cells. So there's one of them. There's a random number, and here are, now I've got 10 of them, and every time I press the F9 key, they will change to something else. All right, so now what I want is the value of x that corresponds to each of these random numbers. So here I would tell Excel which value of x I want. It turns out I want whatever value appears in this cell whenever I change the value that's in that cell. In fact, for all these different values here, I would like to calculate the value of x that corresponds to each one of these. So the way one does that in Excel is to just do a what if data table. So you go to the data tab here, go to what if analysis, data table, and then it's going to ask you, what is my, this is a column-oriented data table, what is my column input cell? That is, where do I want it to put the sensitivity values? And my column input cell, it turns out, is right here. All right. And so it's going to substitute each of those values in for that, in that spot, and come out with the corresponding value of x. And there you go. So here's your simulation of 10 values. And if you press F9, it'll just do it again and again and so forth. So I did a simulation of 10 here. This could be a simulation of 100. It could be a simulation of 1,000 or 5,000. But anyway, that's the way you would create a simulation in this modeling environment. I would like to add that if you're doing this in Excel, you might also want to explore other modeling environments that are in Excel, such as SIPMath modeler tools, ChanceCalc, or Frontline Systems Analytic Solver. All of those will help you model and do simulations well in this Excel environment. So let me shift back now to our last topic, which is the equation maker. And the question comes up, and now if you open the equation maker workbook, here's what you will see. In this data set, I have, as you know from my previous examples, 3,474 data for the weight of steelhead in British Columbia. This is the 10-term metalog that corresponds to that, but I could also do a 3-term metalog, which would be a unimodal approximation to that. Now, for the curves that are displayed here, which is the blue CDF curve here and also the blue PDF curve here, what is the exact equation of those curves? What if instead of wanting to carry around 3,474 data, what if you just wanted to carry around one simple equation that corresponds to this CDF and this PDF? Well, what you would need to do is substitute these A coefficients into the actual Metalog equation, and then you'd have an equation that does that. Well, that's what this equation maker does. So if I click this button here, this workbook does have a macro in it. If I click this button here, make Metalog functions, well, you see what it's done here. It's made the Metalog quantile function, that is x as a function of y, and that's in Excel format. And then down here, it's made the Metalog probability density function, and that's also an Excel equation. And it did that by substituting in these actual values for the A coefficient. So you can see the quantile function is here. And if you look at it up above here, it has the actual A coefficient values substituted into it. If you look at the PDF equation, that's the actual exact equation of the probability density function that is plotted here. Both of those, the QF and the PDF are plotted as functions of cumulative probability Y. So if you wanted to, for example, just carry around the equation, carry it into another workbook, you could, well, let me just show for a moment. The equation you'd actually use for this, for reasons I've explained before, is you'd probably want to use a 10-term metalog for this. And if you did use a 10-term metalog, then you'd want to remake these equations, and now you see the equation for the quantile function is longer because it has 10 terms now, and so is the equation for the PDF. But that's fine. This is all updated now. And then if you wanted to use these equations, these exact equations in another workbook, you see I have this exact same equation, but it is referring to the y that is in this cell L55. So I've already programmed in the reference cell. And so if you wanted to use these in another workbook, you could simply copy these equations, and let's say for the moment that I wanted to put it into the combining expert opinion workbook. Maybe I'm building up an example, maybe a complicated modeling example of some sort, and I could press Control V. I could paste them into this workbook, and this is for steelhead weight, right? So there it is. And there's a little reminder here that this is a 10-term Metalog. It's unbounded, and the same thing for the PDF. And they're both referring to the same Y. So if I wanted to make a simulation cell out of it, I could put a rand in there. And every time I press the F9 key, I'd get another value off. But you could also put deterministic values of Y in there, use them to make plots of either the PDF, the QF, the quantile function, or both. So anyway, that's how you would do it. You could pick up the equations and actually move the exact probability distribution, which is really a very short formula, and use that in place of what otherwise might have to be 3,474 data that you would no longer have to carry around if you're happy to use the distributions in place of that data. So that completes the demo on doing, at least beginning to build up a modeling environment within these Microsoft Excel Metalog workbooks. So overall, this now completes the workshop. We've done the last section of it, and I wish to thank you very much. This is the Metalog distributions, the future of risk management quantification, but we could also say the present of risk management quantification, because everything is ready, is here and ready to go, and it's just a matter of picking it up and using it, getting used to it, and then hopefully you will become faster and better in all of the various risk management activities in which you are participating. So I offer you my best regards. If you have any questions or need any help or support in any way, just feel free to reach out. You see my email address is there, and just send me a quick email. I'll be happy to reply. Thanks very much, all. Have a great day.